Right. Welcome to the House Vermont Legislature's Committee on Environment and Energy. This afternoon, we're going to continue with H126 and welcome Bob Zano in to give us a run through of Vermont conservation design. Welcome.
Thank you. It's great to be here this afternoon. I think I will need permission to share my screen. Oh, got it.
I was in the restaurant that you couldn't describe. Fine, I should have known it was time to leave. Oh, you walk by.
There you go.
Yeah, I had been there with Laura.
Oh, you great. Yeah. All right. Thank you, Madam Chair and committee members. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here. For the record, my name is Robert Zano. I'm a natural community ecologist with the Vermont Department of Fish and Wildlife. I'd like to take you through the science behind the Vermont conservation design, which I know you have heard mentioned many times. I'd like to go through the pieces that make up the design, show you how they all fit together, and then show you how we've been understanding and applying the final results of Vermont conservation design. And then at the end, I have just a few reflections on the intersection of H126 and Vermont conservation design. Just by way of background, I've worked for the Fish and Wildlife Department since 2008. For that entire time, I've had a couple of roles, but always focused on the ecological inventory and assessment, natural communities, forest blocks, and landscape ecology. I just wanted to start with the mission of the department because it really tees up why we worked on the Vermont Conservation Design Project. The mission is the conservation of our fish, wildlife, plants, and their habitats for the people of Vermont. And as I believe you've heard, maybe even seen this exact slide before already, that is an enormous number of species, something like 24,000 to 43,000 different species that are estimated to be here in Vermont. Most of them species that—
Sorry to interrupt you. Of the four things we have from you, which one are we on?
Yeah, it says presentation.
That's the present.
The second
Oh,
one.
I'm sorry. Yes. So
Okay.
I submitted the presentation and the 3 written reports.
The second one.
Yes.
Thank you.
So while people are kind of catching up with you, I almost asked this question the other day when we did see the slide, but I think you're the right person to ask. The estimate is pretty broad. And how do scientists make those estimates? And, why such a big range?
It's a big range, I think, because we just don't know much about many of these taxons. This estimate came out of, I believe, the Vermont Biodiversity Project, which predates my work in this field. So I guess I don't know the exact details how they came up with that number, but I would guess they're using information about the rate at which species are discovered and found to make some reasoned estimates about what, if we continue sort of at the same pace, what we're likely to find. I think the takeaway here is not the specific numbers so much, but the fact that there's so much we don't know about biodiversity still. And I think others have made that point as well. The vertebrate animals are just that little yellow slice of the pie that you can probably barely see, whereas things like invertebrate animals and fungi make up a huge slice of our biodiversity in the state. And when we talk about biodiversity, I think species are the place we naturally gravitate towards, but it's also the ecological processes and the settings that all interact to create that diversity of life when we talk about biodiversity. So I think of biodiversity as largely related to species, but not just species. So how do we protect all those, especially in light of all these threats that I probably don't need to go into great detail on, but particularly with climate change, we know that the climate has changed in the past and species have adapted to that. Species can shift on the landscape to find new places, to find the right mix of climate and setting where they can thrive. But combine that with challenges like habitat loss and fragmentation, the introduction of non-native invasive species, and there are big threats for biodiversity. So how do we deal with all that uncertainty and these big challenges? And this is just to reiterate that climate change point. These maps on the lower right here, the top series of figures there shows the ranges of two tree species, beech and hemlock, two common trees. We can probably see both of them out the window here. They always are commonly growing together here in Vermont now. But the left side of that series that's labeled 12Ka and has the blue and the orange shapes, that's showing where beech and hemlock grew 12,000 years ago during the time of continental glaciation. And they've slowly moved back north to their current range where they overlap. They were able to do that because the landscape was intact and unfragmented, and there was the ability of ecological processes and movement over vast distances. Now they're going to be using that same adaptation, that same process is going to be going on, but in a fragmented landscape. And on the left is just showing how Vermont sits at this regional crossroads of connectivity, ecological landscape connectivity. And we connect from the Adirondacks to Maine and the Gaspé Peninsula in Quebec, the Sutton Mountains in Quebec to the north of the state, all the way down into the Berkshires. Major ecological corridors, a crossroads here in Vermont. It's not new, this awareness of the uncertainty and the unknowns of biological diversity and conservation. And scientists have for a long time used what's called the coarse filter, fine filter approach to conservation, where you can't focus on 40,000 species each individually. We can do that for species like moose and bear, brook trout, wood turtles, but we can't do it for all of those 40,000 species. So find a feature that is bigger, easier to deal with than the needs of an individual species, but where if you can conserve that feature, it will bring along many, many species with it. So the examples here are if we conserve alder swamps along streams, we're likely to conserve much of the habitat for wood turtles. If we conserve spruce swamps, black spruce swamps up in the Northeast Kingdom and a few other places in the state, we're likely to conserve spruce grouse and the moss that only grows on herbivore dung, like moose dung, splachnum moss. So this approach has been the focus of a lot of conservation work. Natural communities were the original coarse filter, things like hemlock forests and cattail swamps. Figure out what those natural communities are, what species are likely to use them, and then conserve good examples of them. But that work now needs to incorporate a bigger scale of connections between natural communities, connections across the broad landscape, because we know from what I just showed about the beech and the hemlock that the species are not going to all stay together in a natural community. Each species is going to be moving around the landscape on its own. These smaller coarse filters are no longer going to work in this era of climate change. We need bigger coarse filters. And that's what the Vermont Conservation Design was an effort to look at. What are the set of those things bigger than individual species that we could conserve to give us confidence in bringing many of those 20 to 40,000 species along? We like to think of this as a practical scientific vision for sustaining an ecologically functional landscape, one that has the species we have now, that allows species to shift and adapt over time, and one that it's a vision that uses what I think are relatively simple features. You may not agree at first, but I think they're relatively simple compared to models that show dots or arbitrary areas on a map. And I'll explain that more as we go through. And it's a vision that depends on the full range of conservation, stewardship, and management. It's not about locking areas up. It's about figuring out what functions and values can the landscape provide, and how can we efficiently get at those functions and values. And I want to mention that I was one of a number of people who worked on this. Mr. Eric Sorensen and I are co-authors on the overall summary report of Vermont Conservation Design. There were many others in the agency and partners. I'll show a full list a little later who worked on this as well. So starting from the end, if we stack up all those force filters that came out of this assessment, this is the map of the ecologically functional landscape that we've developed. It's a landscape that's intact. It has intact functioning ecosystems. It's connected. You can follow pathways through this landscape, and it's diverse. It is not just the traditional rock and ice conservation of conserving just the mountaintops or the wastelands that no one could farm or do anything else productive on. It represents the full range of settings in Vermont. If the functions of these places can be maintained over time, it gives us high confidence that biological diversity will persist and adapt, and that will retain that richness that we have. That overall map is the sum of 3 different scales. Well, really mostly 2. Landscape scale features and natural community and habitat scale features. And I want to go through each of these sets. At the landscape scale, a key unit that we use is the forest block. And sometimes that's called a habitat block. These are areas of contiguous forests that are unfragmented by roads, development, and agriculture, or you could say they're bounded by those features. And you can see that here. The purple is the habitat blocks. So this is actually Mount Philo, I believe, in the center of the screen. And you can see the outline of the purple is roughly the outline of the forest and other habitats. There can be open wetlands, other cliffs and outcrops, other features in there. But the natural areas that are contiguous. And you can see holes where there's development of some kind. We mapped, the Fish and Wildlife Department, led by Mr. Sorensen, mapped 4,055 habitat blocks in the state of Vermont.
Say that again, 4,000.
I believe it's 4,055. In Vermont conservation design, we prioritized those habitat blocks based on different functions. We started with interior forest, and that's the map on the left with the purple. Which blocks are highest priority for the interior forest functions they provide? And that was different in different regions of the state. Interior forest in the Northeast Kingdom is going to be very different than interior forest in the Champlain Valley because of the history of land use and what remains. So you can see smaller blocks in the Champlain Valley and bigger blocks in some other regions of the state. But for each region, and we did this over 9 what we call biophysical regions, we identified the best areas of interior forest. You'll notice that those don't all connect, however. So we started again, and we looked at what's the network of connectivity blocks that builds a backbone of connections across the state. How do we link places together? And you'll see that the orange blocks selected are largely continuous. You can trace a pathway. You can be the moose that Mr. Austin talked about the other day that could wander from one town through the Worcester Range down to, I forget exactly where that moose went, but it's the pathway that allows for movement like that, individual animals and species over time. These pathways were informed heavily by the work of Mark Anderson at the Nature Conservancy and the connected and resilient and connected landscape work. I'm going to skip to the far right here, physical landscape diversity blocks. The ones that are in dark red, those blocks are an effort to make sure that the design captures that full reflection of Vermont's landscapes, so that it's not just high mountains where, just because of land use history, is often where the best, largest chunks of forest are left. We can't have all of our biological diversity if we're just conserving high elevation lands. So by identifying those blocks that are in red, it's an effort to diversify the settings that are in here, to find flats with sandy soils or clay plain settings, or calcium-rich bedrock, which is in abundance in that band down the eastern side of Vermont, the Waits River Bedrock Formation.
Representative Stebbins has a question.
So, Madam Chair, I'm trying to So when I zoom in, it looks like white and grayish mean highest priorities, whereas the colors are high priorities.
Oh,
So I guess I'm trying to figure out, like, when I look at this, I would think that the white is where development is. Can you help me understand this?
I think I can, yes. I'm sorry. I should have mentioned this, that there's a gray outline underneath every map that is the sum of the 4 features you're looking at here. So where the purple is highlighted, the light gray is showing the orange and those red blocks behind to give you a sense of how these all intersect.
So the color just refers to this, like, or the yellow is highlighting the connectivity blocks.
Yes,
But the gray and the white, or the light gray, is showing all the other layers.
that's correct.
So where would you see areas that, like, you're just like, whatever, like Burlington, that's done.
Right. So
What
those
color is that?
the areas that were not recognized as highest priority are the white.
White. Thank you.
Since we've interrupted you, I think gets to one of my questions that I've always had tried to understand. So how much of this is an artifact of our current land use versus reliant on the underlying geology and other features?
The size of what's available is a reflection of the land use and how the forests are distributed in our state now. The effort to get representation was based on looking at the state as a whole as if it were not developed. And by that, I mean trying to represent all the different settings that could occur in Vermont. Some of those are largely developed, like sandplain settings, but making an effort to ensure that that's part of the design.
And so the open kind of white area in the central eastern side, is that a reflection of development? It's not that developed.
I think, yeah, without looking for sure at all the forest blocks there, I think that is a part of the state that is fairly heavily roaded. And there's a fair bit of agricultural land in there. And so I think the forest blocks are smaller in that part of the state. And so that geology is, and other features are represented in other parts, in other areas nearby, I think just slightly to the east and west.
See.
Other questions about the blocks? Because if not, I'd move on to the riparian areas.
Thank you.
So we have those 3 forest block layers. Water, of course, critical for conservation of biological diversity. In fact, so critical that when going back before Vermont Conservation Design into a project that was originally called the Natural Resources Mapping Project, the agency brought together all sorts of experts on aquatic biology and ecology, and they would not prioritize the surface waters. All the waters are connected. They're all critical for conserving biological diversity. And so Vermont Conservation Design highlights any undeveloped section of, well, the water is obviously undeveloped, but the riparian area alongside those rivers, streams, lakes, and ponds. All of that is highest priority for maintaining biological diversity. We've further identified areas in there that have natural cover. So places that are forested or have naturally occurring wetlands. Lastly, to have all this hang together, we've prioritized wildlife road crossings, which is a little strange because it's the only feature that's not a natural feature. But places where wildlife can easily move across roads is critical to having that connectivity around the state. And so we've highlighted sections of road where cover comes right down on either side, and there's good opportunities for connections between those forest blocks. I'd like to show you how these individual pieces work.
Representative Smith has a question.
I do. Thank you. I know that there are tunnels for spotted salamanders in Moncton. And I've heard that there are plans to put tunnels for game, larger game under some of the highways. How are you gonna direct a deer to go to that tunnel down the end of the road?
Signs.
Yeah,
Deer crossing, put a sign, deer crossing.
we know that wildlife use culverts and bridges as pathways under many roads. And the department has done a lot of work, including camera trapping. It's not trapping, it's taking camera pictures of wildlife as they move through to get a sense of where wildlife are moving and have efforts to enhance those or just maintain them so that wildlife can continue to move. I know in some places there are fences all along roads that will funnel animals,
Yeah.
not in Vermont, but other places. I don't know enough about the individual movement and our options right now to say much more about that. John, perhaps you'd like to.
Oh, it's not a big push for it right now?
There's a big push for maintaining that connectivity under roads.
Okay,
I don't know about if there's a push to funnel wildlife into.
okay, all right.
Madam Chair. While I'm sitting awkwardly in the corner here, just to say, John Austin, Lands and Habitat Program Manager with the Vermont Fish and Wildlife Department. I'm merely here to help answer questions that, fill in the details for Bob. So to the extent I can be helpful, happy to do so. I don't want to derail presentation, but we are deeply involved with our colleagues at VTrans on fish and wildlife passage structures associated with state highways. And happy to talk more about that when it's convenient for you.
I'd like to at some point.
Yeah, that's a good idea. We will take you up on that offer at some point. Thanks.
Thank you.
It's a good example of the specific ways that we take the end product of this and think about where that work is most important, where it contributes most to maintaining that ecological function. This is diving into the individual interior forest blocks. So here's that map again. The purple is those highest priority interior forest blocks. Gray is that overall network. And we've identified for each of these features the functions of the feature. So in this case, interior forest is about interior forest species, wide-ranging mammals, air and water quality, and so forth. We've then identified broad guidelines for maintaining those ecological functions. So avoiding fragmentation right into the interior, limiting development to the margins, maintaining a diversity of forest structures and age classes within the block. Forest management is perfectly compatible with maintaining these forest blocks and minimizing invasive species. Broad goals, but really important steps to maintain the integrity of these features. Connectivity blocks, same basic unit, a forest block, but different functions, wildlife movement and dispersal, genetic exchange, etc. The way to maintain these functions in the connectivity blocks is a little different. It's still about reducing fragmentation, but now the edges become much more important because you want to allow for the movement out of the block to other blocks. Riparian areas are all about the way water is interacting with the land and maintaining the ability of the land to have those interactions, functioning floodplains, natural river processes, and the ability of species to move along riparian corridors. Those waterways are really critical movement pathways for wildlife. And they're especially important where we have intact natural vegetation, which here I'm showing a map of forest blocks in orange. That's those connectivity blocks. The surface waters and riparian areas broadly in blue. And then the dark brown is places in that network where there's water or natural vegetation. And I hope you can see how it starts to tie those blocks together in places where you don't have great block to block to block stepping stones. So species can move from a block and along a waterway in the riparian area and get to another block. This is Dead Creek, Snake Mountain, Buck Mountain, the mouth of the Otter Creek, that portion of the Champlain Valley. Physical landscape blocks. These are again about maintaining forest. They're not going to be necessarily as big as those high quality interior forest blocks, but they're going to have different settings. So different species like the species that you find in a clay plain forest. There are plants and likely invertebrates and other species that don't occur in other settings. So having opportunities for those species to find suitable habitat and maintain those habitats over time. And then the road crossings, as I mentioned. The picture here and the map that is perhaps a little hard to read, but the Google Maps shot there is of the Shutesville Hill Wildlife Crossing along Route 100, right just north of the Waterbury Stowe line, I believe. It's one of the only places, really the only place, where there's good connectivity between Mount Mansfield and its big forest block and the Worcester Range and the large forest block associated with that. So from the spine of the Green Mountains to the Worcester Range, which then connects up all the way to Maine and Quebec. That's the landscape scale. Maybe I'll pause there for a minute and see if there's any questions.
Not seeing any.
Okay. The next scale is the natural community scale. So we're going to finer features, more specific and more targeted in the species or processes that they're, we use the word capturing, which is maybe not the best word, but that they're conserving the opportunity. Four features here: natural communities, which are really the 97 different natural community types like hemlock forest or cattail swamp identified in Vermont. A subset of waters that contain particularly important collections of species or, again, physical settings that are a further prioritization of that broad riparian network. Wetlands and caves and mines, which I don't have a map because they're somewhat sensitive features and easily disturbed if people are exploring around in those. Just focus on natural communities for a minute. These are things that can be very common, like this forest outside the window here, or something very rare, like a rich fen that's may not be much bigger than this room and is the combination of a particular geology and water movement, groundwater movement that comes out of the ground, slopes over the ground, and allows for the persistence of unique plant species. Each of those has its own species associated with it that we know of, and likely many others. We can assume that the top of Camel's Hump with its alpine area is always going to have different species than a rich fen in Orange County. So it's a way to capture many species, conserve the needs of many species efficiently. And here's just some, I mean, it's great, always great to look at natural communities, I think. They're real places on the ground, like the top of Camel's Hump, or below that alpine area is a black gum swamp in Vernon, an oak forest, or a river cobble shore. The other features in that natural community and habitat scale are not so much identified as precise places on the ground, but as particular types of habitat that we need to have on the landscape if we're going to have the species associated with them. And these are young and old forests, shrublands, and grasslands. And these maps are not intended to show that everywhere in green or yellow here is where those need to be, but that those features need to be somewhere within those areas. I'll explain that a little bit more here with young and old forests. Young and old forests support a diversity of species and ecological processes. And actually, this was great. I was watching the testimony of Mr. Larson this morning, and he had a picture of a graph that showed different successional stages. And I was really intrigued by that paper, so I found it. And the paper, which is called Biodiversity Along Temperate Forest Succession, was a study of diversity within forests of different ages. And what they found was, actually it's very succinct and I thought very neat. They found that both diversity and the number of unique species is highest in early and late stages of forest succession. So young forests and old forests. But they also concluded that when you look across all the forest age classes, you need all of them if you're going to conserve all the species associated with forests. You need that full range. And this is great because that's exactly what Vermont Conservation Design is proposing, that we have more young forest and more old forest than we have on our landscape now. They're both components that we're missing. And that we target them appropriately to get those functions across different forest types in different regions of the state. So the target for young forest is 3 to 5%. That comes from good scientific estimates of the abundance of young forest here prior to the arrival of Europeans based on natural disturbances. So based on how often a forest blows over and how big that area of blow over is, how often fire occurs, you can recreate what that distribution would be across the landscape.
Representative Sakowitz has a question.
Yeah, thank you. This is great. So when we're talking about young forests and old forests, we're putting them in these very separate categories. But you just also said that the number for young forests, this percentage, comes from pre-European settlement estimates. Presumably, and you said that those occurred from blowdowns and things like that, from natural processes. So wouldn't we expect that to be then included actually within old forests? Because if we just leave them alone, they'll undergo these natural disturbances over time. And so within those areas that we just leave alone, we'll see this natural regeneration from natural events happening. So how do we, almost seems like we're dividing things up in this case in a very artificial way that's not necessarily reflected in our natural environment.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I think that's right. If we let areas of forest grow old over time, some of those areas are going to have natural disturbances, wind throw, fire, not so much for most of our forests in Vermont, but insect and disease outbreaks, native species of insects and disease, that will create areas of young forest. And mostly those are tiny little patches, individual trees or a small clump of trees, but less frequently you get very large disturbances. And that's when you get that really great habitat for young forest species. So yes, that would happen. I think the way our forests age class distribution is now, we have mostly middle-aged forests. I think they're less susceptible to some of those disturbances like wind throw because of just the way the canopy structure is and the way wind affects it and the vigor of the trees. So we may not be seeing disturbance patterns happening the same way they did 300 or 400 years ago. I think, yes, we would get that. So at the landscape scale, this is where I myself struggle sometimes thinking about forests like an individual place versus the whole landscape. I think to get meaningful young forest from natural disturbance would require a large landscape area of old forest, perhaps more than the 9% that Vermont Conservation Design calls for. So I think it makes sense that in the context we're in now, we wouldn't expect most of our young forest to come from that natural disturbance. Some will come from it for sure, but there's also going to be a lot that's created from management activities.
So we just need more than 9% old forest.
Well, if your goal is to maximize the amount of young forest created naturally, I guess. But I think, as you've probably heard from many others, there's a whole range of things that we're trying to get with forests.
Thank you.
Representative Stebbins.
Thanks, Madam Chair. Can you repeat that again? To get a meaningful percentage of young forest, we actually do need to manage. Can you say what you just said again? If you remember.
Yeah. I think right now the forests are in a scenario where the best way to get young forest at a scale that will continue to meet the needs of species is probably through forest management rather than relying on natural disturbances. You could, in theory, have all your young forests come from natural disturbance, but it would mean all the forests might not be managed.
I guess, yeah, just I've observed that with increased intense windstorms, we're certainly seeing young to middle-aged trees get blown over in significant places, at least where I spend time.
That's a good point. And with climate change, we see changes in the natural disturbance regimes. And so we can only read so much into the past, I guess, on that. I think the larger takeaway here is that we want this diversity of age classes across the forest, and we have a variety of ways to get them, which are consistent with the goals of managing and gaining other benefits from our forest. So we can have this full suite of age classes, and we can also gain other benefits from our forests. The 10% old forest, if you run science that has those pre-European numbers, which show something like 60% of the landscape was old forest, we think using professional judgment and understanding of the sizes of old forests, that if we had roughly 10%, 9% really of Vermont's forest as old forest, it would be a very significant reintroduction of those functions on the landscape.
Representative Timmons.
Thanks, Madam Chair. So you listened to the testimony that you heard this morning, and it was stated that the opinion of the witness was that young forest should be 15%. Any sense on where that's coming from?
Yeah, there's a wide range of numbers proposed for how much young forest we could have on the landscape. I think there's no question that more young forest would provide more benefit for the species that depend on it. But I think where the challenge is how you strike the balance between those species, and all the other species using all the other stages of forest development. And unless you're going to take one place in the forest and continually keep it at young forest, at a certain point, which is something like 15 to 20 years, it's going to get older, and then it's no longer young forest, no longer providing those functions. And this is one of those things that's a lot easier to show with a image, but if you have 15% that you start out with young, it gets old. You have to cut or have some disturbance happen in another 15%, and then that gets old. And before you know it, all of your landscape is only getting up to forests with let's see, trying to do the math in my head. I can't do it on the fly, but it's not even 100 years, I think, because you just need more young forest sooner. And there's only so much space to have the young forest and then it getting older. If you're interested in more info on this, I think an image or a chart is an easier way to describe it. But the upshot is you lose the balance if your young forest target is too high.
Thanks.
Oh, Representative Saku.
Thank you, Chair. You were talking about sounds like a lot of the reference is for this proposed, forest composition of Vermont conservation design is now referenced back to pre-European settlement. So I have a couple of questions about that. One is, how well do we really understand what the forests were like back then? What's our sort of error bars on that? And then I'll answer that and I'll think of my second part.
Okay. I think we have a number of sources. There's some firsthand accounts of early Europeans arriving here describing the forest. There is paleoecological evidence, which is looking at things like pollen in sediment cores. So what type of plant species were present on the landscape and in what abundance. So you can start to estimate, if you see lots of pollen from fire-dependent species, you can infer that a fire happened. I guess I can't go way into the details.
I don't expect you to go way into
it's that
I guess it's more of I'm getting more in terms of like a sense of like, how confident are we in the numbers? If we're saying, that it was 3 to 4%, young forest,
right.
Could it really be 1 or 2 or 6 or 7, or is it really constrained? Like, just trying to get a sense of like how there's obviously some error, whatever estimate it makes, you have some error. I'm trying to get a sense of how big that error.
Right. It's a great question. There are some key papers that did the math on the disturbance return intervals, the wind and the fire and sizes. And I could look back at what those error margins were in that. Things like the paleoecological work, I don't know as much about the error margins in those. I could look into it more if you're interested.
Okay. It just seems like if we're going to be using those as a reference, that it would be really nice to know how, just how reliable those numbers are and what sort of range they're likely falling within.
Right. My guess is, like a lot of things in ecology, you have all sorts of variation over time, but sort of a core area, like most often you're going to be in this range. So,
And then my other thought about this is, it seems like from what we understand that pre-European settlement doesn't mean that there was no forest management, but the forests, at least a lot of places were actually quite intensely managed. And so if we're talking about that time, we have to be cognizant of the fact that we're referencing a managed landscape already, not one that was really just undisturbed by humans.
that's right. It was a peopled landscape for sure. I think there's some work into how much influence and where that management was. I know for sure in coastal areas and maybe along Lake Champlain, there was more intensive management in small focused zones. There's a recent paper from the Harvard Forest, David Foster, that, I forget the title of it, but the takeaway was that they found little evidence in the paleoecological record to suggest large-scale burning of the landscape, aside from those coastal areas and some maybe other areas in southern New England a bit more coastal.
Thank you.
But it's a lot of inference. I mean, none of us were there, so we don't know.
Right. Yeah.
Grasslands are easier because grassland species are not, Vermont probably until the present time probably didn't support a lot of grassland species prior to our changes to the landscape. But grassland species, which may have at one time depended on the prairies in the Midwest, which are now largely converted to agriculture, have found habitat here in our agricultural fields, and those species are really important, species like bobolink or savanna sparrow. And so maintaining the open land habitat is really important to keep that biological diversity here. All the more so because their native habitats are nowhere near what they used to be. And so they're displaced species. And so this is showing how there are certain parts of the state where that grassland habitat is particularly valuable. And then the management needs for that particular feature in the design, I want to show you how specific they are compared to what I showed you for forest blocks. So as we've gone down in scale, those management and conservation needs are more focused too. So those are the landscape and natural community features. Species are a key part of the design. They're not something we map, although of course the Vermont Fish and Wildlife Department in our natural heritage database tracks occurrences of rare species. But I want to show how two rare species intersect with the design. The first one is the northern pale painted cup. It's a relative of the brighter red paintbrush of the western states. And this is a species that in Vermont grows only in Smuggler's Notch at the base of those big calcareous, calcium-rich cliffs. And if you scramble up through the rocks and talus, you can see this plant there. Very rare, but it's in these natural communities that are in a large forest block of the Mount Mansfield and area. And it's likely to persist as long as the climate is suitable. And hopefully if the climate changes, maybe it can shift, whether it's up the mountain or northward to find another suitable site. It's a species that I would argue has its needs met by this coarse filter. In contrast, the spiny soft-shelled turtle, which nests on these tiny little beaches on Lake Champlain that are, and they're subject to predation by raccoons, that can get there easily because of the developed landscape, by the trampling of visitors to the beach who just are unaware of the value of the habitat. And if it wasn't for staff and volunteers going out every year to put up fences and help protect this species and its nests, it might not persist in Vermont. And that's going to be a fine filter species. And no matter how much we work on Vermont conservation design, we're still going to have to put that particular effort in to keep spiny softshell here. So here again are the pieces stacked up, and just restating what I think I've already said. I just really want to hammer home that point on how this connected and diverse and intact landscape allows species to adapt to climate change. I think this is our resilience plan for biological diversity, because it lets species, we have confidence, I think, that this will let species shift and adapt in response to climate change and rearrange themselves on the landscape so that they can persist into the future. And so despite the fact that we have new challenges, this is the way we can let them adapt on their own. I know that looks like a lot of Vermont, perhaps, and I just wanted to show, here is a map with all 4,055 habitat blocks on here, and you can see how green Vermont is, which I think is a really, I mean, it's a tremendous resource to our state. And there I've taken all those places away and just whittled this down to the highest priority areas in Vermont conservation design. And I just wanted to reflect, I guess, that this really is a prioritization, even though it identifies a lot of the state. And we have such tremendous value in all of the green that was on that first slide. It's places where species live, where ecological processes occur. And I think many people have a strong connection to the land. And this is a prioritization that doesn't even allow for all of those. I think you've seen something similar from Mr. Austin 2 days ago, but just showing how Vermont conservation design draws on the state's rich history of scientific thinking and conservation planning. I mentioned that Nature Conservancy's Resilient and Connected tool, or Resilient and Connected Network. And there's really strong overlap between those two products. They answer slightly different questions, which is why they give slightly different results, but there's just a tremendous overlap and meshing of those. There's the work done by Staying Connected to map regional linkages, and just a long history of work in the department and elsewhere focused on this.
Can you articulate the different questions that they're answering?
I believe that the question of the resilient and connected network would be something like, which places on the landscape are most resilient and going to allow for that climate adaptation? I'm not phrasing that well. Whereas Vermont conservation design is what is everything we need on the landscape to have ecological function.
Sure.
Can you
Representative
go back to
Sedalia.
the slide before?
To this one?
That one and or the one preceding. So where on that map or the following map, where are the places where we should discourage human beings living? Where are the places that we should encourage human beings to live?
Well, not an easy question, right? I think this is where it goes back to the functions of those individual features. So if we look at these forest blocks here, I think we want to keep development as much as possible to the edges if we're going to maintain the functions of that forest block. If more and more people are building and moving into the interior of what are now intact forest blocks, the function is going to be greatly decreased. And if you think about the way that a long road or driveway going into the woods creates edge along both sides and around the whole footprint of development, it's sort of a disproportionate impact to the block to have those kind of developments. But I think it's sorry.
No, go ahead.
I think it's really a place-by-place analysis and decision. And this provides a broad framework for thinking about that. But then it also gives us the tools to drill down and assess a particular place.
Okay. Thank you. So that's reflected on this map, on the spaces that are white on this map.
Right, those are the areas where I think those impacts will still have, I mean, there's still adverse impacts to biodiversity by changing the forest or developing it, for sure. But I think the highest priority places shown on this map are the ones where that impact is most acute and has the greatest degradation of that functional landscape.
Thank you.
Dennis Smith.
Thank you. I think I heard you suggest that roads going into forests aren't a really good idea. New roads.
Right?
Could you talk about that a little bit?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think there's a strong scientific literature about the impact of roads on the landscape and their potential vectors for non-native species. They're places where wildlife may be disturbed because of the traffic. They're a vector for development. They bring people in and open up new areas of land. So yeah, there's known impacts to putting roads into forest blocks.
Thank you very much. I'd like to talk to you after you're done.
Okay,
Thank you.
sure. Here's that list of partners that I said I had. I didn't leave anyone off. I'm very worried about that. So I want to shift gears and talk about how we're using Vermont conservation design. We've completed the landscape part of this project in 2015, and we completed the habitat and natural community portion of the project in 2018. So we've been using particularly the forest blocks component of this for a number of years now. It's all of these things up here. I won't read them all to you, but I mean, it's a big part of how we assess lands that we're acquiring as a department. It's a way to take an individual landowner's property and put it into a larger context. You can show, look, you are here. You're on the edge of a forest block where you have a connection to another block. You're in the center. You're in a riparian area. You have a unique natural community. All of those things can come from this design. And then you can show you're here and look at how your property is part of this large connection between the Adirondacks and Maine, or whatever the circumstances are. We use this as a way to inform our understanding of projects when we do regulatory work. So Act 250 or Section 248. It's a tool just like our maps of deer wintering areas or maps of bear mass stands to help us understand what's there on the landscape. And of course, we have a robust program working with towns to apply Vermont conservation design and the forest block mapping to town planning. Here's what I think it's not. It's certainly not a map of all the land that should be permanently conserved. It's something like 69% of Vermont. I think it's going to take the whole range of conservation strategies to maintain this landscape into the future. Although that said, permanent conservation is sure an important tool. It's not a good jurisdictional trigger for regulatory processes like Act 250. And by that, I mean, the lines in Vermont conservation design are meant to be informative. They're not something that can just be taken and plopped into a zoning map. And you say, if you're on this side of the line, this happens. And if you're on this side, this can't happen. It's just not that sort of project. And the data that went into it doesn't support that use. And related to that, it's not chiseled in stone. We're going to continue to work on this and advance it and improve it over time. And we're actually doing that right now. We are, and I guess I want to frame that we have very high confidence in this design and the core concepts and the broad outlines that came out of this work. But we're always doing more inventory. We're always doing more analysis. And so our understanding is going to improve over time, and we can tweak this product to make it better. I've highlighted A&R's inventory work. I mean, everything from mapping natural communities to lake and pond assessments. The whole gamut of work can feed into this, but we're going to continue to refine and improve the prioritization. Right now, design uses habitat blocks that look like this. This is Mount Philo again. And I want to show you, in 2016, there was a new map created of forest and other land cover in Vermont using LiDAR, which is laser mapping of the landscape at a very high resolution. And now we have forest block data that looks like this. Very much more resolution to what we can see. And I want to just point out where those arrows are. Look at the change in what we can detect on the landscape. And think about what that might mean for us trying to assess how are species going to move in and out of the Mount Philo forest block. Here, it looks like there's no connections between those blocks. Now we start to see, oh, there's a pathway there. And that may or may not change the prioritization in the design, but it can sure help when we zoom into a particular place to think about what's going on there and how everything is coming together at a place. So by the end of this year, I sure hope, although maybe don't hold us to this just in case, but we're working on new mapping and prioritization of the 3 forest block components. That is, again, we have high confidence in what we've done. So I don't expect it to be anything radically different. It's just going to be some tweaking around the edges based on this new data. So we'll have that. We'll have new reports, and we'll update the BioFinder website where all of this information is available. So I guess just kind of some overall thoughts. It's a scientific vision for what our ecologically functional landscape could be into the future. We're something like 80% private ownership in Vermont. So I think landowners and what they choose to do, what they want to do, is going to be key to seeing this vision, achieving this vision into the future. It's a vision that depends on all of these features. We can't pick out, say, just the habitat, just the connectivity blocks and old forest and hope to have ecological function. We need the full suite of these things and all interacting together if we're going to have an ecologically functional landscape. And it's a way to bring together many aspects of conservation. It connects forest management, it connects land and water, and it's all without, I think it ties together the work that many people are doing without prescribing exactly. It's, I don't want to say that. It's linking the work that so many people and experts are doing and showing how it all ties together. Vermont conservation design is not prescribing how rivers should be managed. It's saying we need people figuring out how rivers work, and that's what we would like to see in those riparian areas. And of course, we completed this as a science project. We weren't thinking about all these other things, but I think you can imagine all the other values that come out of a landscape that has that ecological function and is intact. So really finally here, I guess just some reflections on the way Vermont conservation design intersects with H126. And I really appreciate that you are looking to Vermont conservation design as the guide to where we should focus conservation in Vermont. I think these really are the places that get that bang for the buck in terms of thinking about conservation, all of the tools that we can apply. What we have not done is really answer these questions about Vermont conservation design. We have not gone through and really done a comprehensive assessment about which features and which places need what type of conservation actions. I think we could do that by things like, okay, interior forest blocks maybe don't all need to be permanently conserved, but maybe within those blocks, there are particular ones that permanent conservation would really provide exceptional value. Maybe there are points in the connectivity network where that could be particularly valuable. Things like old forests that we're counting on for long time spans, permanence is very critical. something like young forest, where it's going to shift across the landscape over time, permanence may not be critical. I'm giving those as examples, but saying that I think these are the sorts of questions that we would need to answer to get at where do we get the most benefit from permanent conservation in the design. And with that, happy to take any more questions you may have.
That was great. Thank you. Do members have questions? Representative Morris.
Thank you, Madam Chair. We might have heard earlier that Vermont Conservation, bless you, Vermont Conservation Design, the plan, how much involvement did the public have with input or in developing this plan?
Yeah, great question. We had a core team of agency staff and nonprofit scientists who were working on this. When we completed the whole effort in 2018, we embarked on an effort to educate and gain feedback from a wide variety of partners. So that was our conservation partners. It was folks like the Vermont Traditions Coalition. Boy, I can't think of the full list of people, but we had a number of sessions where we would go and present the work and solicit feedback. We weren't soliciting feedback so much, but we were open to feedback on anything. But just in the sense that the department doesn't hold a public process to assess our deer wintering area mapping. We have confidence in the science and we'll accept ideas on that, but we wanted to educate and get feedback on the implications of this. How do people interpret it? What does it mean? And so we did that with many partner groups.
Thank you.
I think actually, John, perhaps if you have any recollection of that, that might be helpful.
My memory is challenged these days, but we met with the Vermont Traditions Coalition. We met with the Associated Industries of Vermont. We met with backcountry hunters and anglers, and the typical cast of organizations and interests that would think positively or negatively about a product like this. We wanted to make sure that we covered the full spectrum of interests and really invited the full spectrum of potential criticisms for something like this. I think, as I'd mentioned to you on Tuesday, 15 years ago, thinking about a map like this just wasn't possible. There was no appetite for it. And I understand that. It draws certain implications to private property interests and other things that are very important considerations. So having it today is a privilege for us, and that's why we're very careful in the interpretation and application of these results. Make clear that this is not a blueprint for permanent protection of the Vermont landscape. This is a guidepost to help us make good, informed decisions about how we can maintain the ecological integrity of the state with everybody involved.
I guess if I can, I see this as part of that public process of how Vermont conservation design is used, because we have offered it as scientific information, and how it's used in planning and policy is what's going on right here, I would think.
No further questions, Representative Sevelia.
Yes, thank you. This is a great presentation, great information, as predicted, Madam Chair. So additional questions that I have, and maybe going back to that slide where I asked you where we would want to encourage or discourage humans to be. Another concern that I'm hearing from folks worried about this stuff is about the ability to work the lands. And I think what I'm hearing is that that's possible in doing this. But are there, when we think about this map and these areas, are there areas where it makes more sense to do that? So I think I'm hearing it's more like an intermittent thing, but maybe I'm not. Can you help me understand where we should be thinking about more active management and working of the lands?
Yeah, I think I can. I think there are very few features in here where forest management doesn't have some level of compatibility. The ones that come immediately to mind are old forests, where we're trying to get the natural processes occurring over time without interruption. So it's hard to do that with forest management happening. There are great ways to use management to promote old forest characteristics, which is terrific. But I think it's also really important to have places where nature is running its course and species are uninterrupted. So, but those are limited areas, and they should be, as we conserve those, they should be chosen strategically, I think, so that we get the most conservation value out of them, and we're not making decisions we regret down the road. So that's the one area. The other one, I think, is places like rare natural communities, where you have combinations that just don't occur very often, and the species and processes associated with them are irreplaceable if they were altered or lost. So something like a pitch pine summit, or what would be another good example? Some dry oak woodland natural communities, places that are unique. And if they're not something you can picture, that's because they're something rare and not something we encounter very often. But I think those places, their values might be best maintained if they're also allowed to proceed under natural processes. But again, I think that's not, those are small, discrete areas. They're usually not very productive for timber anyway. So not talking about a huge area. The rest of the design, I think forest management is perfectly compatible and probably very helpful for maintaining landowners' ability to own forest land.
So if we wanted to, what we're focusing on here is conservation, which I think is really important, and biodiversity, making sure that we're maintaining life. So if we wanted to, there are other things that we also are trying to do in this building. So I would be really interested in understanding, looking at a map that kind of highlighted the question that I asked you: where would we encourage people to be? And we're encouraging people not to just be in the white areas, but in areas that are already designated, downtowns and other places. Who would we ask to, who would be the right entity to kind of put a coexist map together? And, so that we're doing, so that I think there's a lot of opposition. I don't know if you heard me speaking to this before about, a sense of we can't do all of the things. And I think we can do all of the things, but, is there a way to kind of put a coexist map together, and who would be the right entity to do something like that?
Well, I think that's a great point, and we want to be able to coexist with nature. I don't know that I can answer who should put that map together. I'm sorry.
No, that's okay. That's okay.
I think that's the sort of thing that it would be great to use Vermont conservation design for, to think about. I mean, I think that's what towns do at the town scale, but it's certainly there to take that larger look too.
Thanks. Representative Tory.
Kind of to that point, on the town level, and the regional level, would we be able to use this information to kind of assess if we are a high ecologically functioning area? Are we medium? Are we low? Like, would there be value in being able to characterize for land use planning? I'm just wondering, I have the same desire to see land use planning tools really grow as a result, really be informed by this work, but also be really accessible on the local level.
The A&R Atlas, which you may be able to speak to for folks that you can use now.
Right. So all of these maps are available on the A&R Atlas and the BioFinder website, which is, I think if you go to biofinder.vermont.gov, you'll get there, and you can zoom in and really see these in relation to.
Specific.
Yeah, I guess I would think of it as not so much an assessment of, I forget exactly how you said it, but like low function now or high function now, but more like what are the features that are most contributing the most to that landscape, to that overall ecologically functional landscape. Because there's all sorts of places that provide ecological function now. And there's also, I don't know if this was implied in what you were saying, but I don't think that having more green or more white necessarily is a judgment. It's just a reflection on what is in a particular place. So it's, I guess I wouldn't think about it like low, medium, high, like that way.
I think it's from energy with the different scenarios. Like we often have a high, medium, low scenario. And I was wondering about thinking about that in land use terms to get a sense of prioritization, like where would we need to act fast in terms of mobilizing philanthropy or whatever to conserve. And I'm just wondering if this kind of knowing and this kind of body of knowledge will help us be able to make decisions and do the right thing faster than we are doing it now. And I wondered, that's why I had a sense of like, I don't know. I feel a lot of urgency around conservation and around adaptation and mitigation. So my goal for planning is that it become easier to do the right thing at the right time.
Yeah, I sure hear that. I think that further prioritization of what's on the screen now is part of the work that would need to be done if this bill passes. I think that's what we would have to do to understand, to make some decisions about, okay, we've got all this area identified for ecological function, but how do we understand what tools and places are on that low, medium, high within the highest priority area.
Thank you.
Who is the right person? You probably do know this answer for us to have in to walk us through the ANR Atlas and the BioFinder and do a little bit of this demonstration that we've just been asking about.
That would be Jens Hilke, our conservation planning biologist.
Okay. I mean, I guess I'm also thinking though of, including some of the designated areas, the downtowns and the water and the sewer with this data.
Yes.
Okay, great.
That's the sort of thing he does.
Great.
Glad you brought that up.
Got him in.
To your question, the program, one of the programs I spoke to on Tuesday was the Community Wildlife Program. So we have 2 people on staff who their whole job is to work with town and regional planning commissions and conservation commissions to help them understand information like this and how it can inform town plans, zoning bylaws, development of town forests, that whole set of stuff, and encourage them to look beyond their community boundaries so they can see themselves and the decisions that they make, the implications of those decisions in a larger context. So I think it was one of those analogies that I drew upon the other day where it's like water dripping on a stone. We're effective at working with communities to the extent that we're in it for the long haul. Those things take a lot of time. So you have to be committed to working and supporting communities and understanding all of this and figuring out how to inform decisions for, in many cases, years to get to that sweet spot.
Representative Sebelia.
Yes. So going to our bill that we're looking at and our goals, I want to make sure that I understand what this is. So in order to support an ecologically functional landscape, sustainable production, natural resources, recreational opportunities, the approximate percentages of each type of conservation category shall be guided by the conservation targets within Vermont Conservation Design. Can you just bring me to that? How would I understand the conservation targets in your presentation?
Well, I might put the question back to the committee if you'll allow me, but my understanding was, or my interpretation of that on reading it was that it's all the parts of Vermont Conservation Design, all the parts that I went through, but perhaps I'm not the one to answer that.
That's confusion.
I think that for me, that refers back to like the 10% old forest.
Those specifically.
Yes.
Okay.
And so can you articulate others besides that one? like?
Well, I think this goes back again to work that we still have to do, because I think we could say, so if we were using those three categories, I think we could probably say something like Old Forest is likely to be the ecological reserve. Young Forest would probably fall into the, I forget the exact name of it, but the third category. Something
Natural
like,
resource management.
yes, thank you.
I think Young Forest could be either the second or the third.
Yeah, that would make sense, I think. Something like grasslands could be the second category focused on habitat. But if we wanted to look at larger features or even this full suite of natural communities, I think we need to spend more time thinking about how they, I think it would be a combination of certain features and certain places within features might fall out differently. So we just have to spend more time to answer that.
These are goals that we're putting into statute. That the approximate percentages of each type of conservation category, those that we are also putting into statute. So we're just the approximate percentages of each type of conservation category or goals shall be guided by the conservation targets within Vermont conservation design. So we're taking these statutorily defined areas, this is my understanding, and our goals, which we are putting in statute, and we're saying right now, A&R, go build us a plan to do that. But I'm hearing you say we're putting goals into statute for conservation targets, which are not yet defined. Is that, so that's what I'm hearing, and I don't know if that's what we're doing. That's my question.
Okay, well, forgive me then, because I think that we know the features and we have the maps to guide us. What we have not done is thought about if you took that full range of conservation tools, everything from voluntary landowner programs to ecological reserves, where does each feature shake out on that whole scale? And even within a particular feature, are there certain places that are going to come out differently on that scale than others? And so use the connectivity blocks as an example again. The Shutesville Hill Wildlife Crossing, that one place where you connect Mount Mansfield to the Worcester Range, that might be the sort of place that, when we think it through, shakes out high on that ecological reserve end. But other areas in the blocks on either side may not shake out there. They could be sustainable resource management areas. So I think it's a combination of place-based thinking and thinking about the functions that we're trying to consider.
Madam Chair, and I feel like this is key. This is a key witness who has key information, and I'm trying to grasp this targets language, and I'm not getting it. Shall be guarded by the targets. Oh, that's goal language.
I offer a bit of perspective.
Sure.
I think herein lies part of the challenge that the agency is perceived with the way that the bill is constructed currently. So there's no fundamental disagreement between this committee and the agency on the importance of the bill, the urgency of the issues that we need to deal with, the need to advance and accelerate more permanent land conservation. Would be 100%. It's more of how do we approach the development of a plan in a practical way, mindful of the questions that Mr. Zano concluded his presentation with. We have a lot of good information, but in order to create a plan that is going to be thoughtful, well-informed, strategic, ambitious, but also achievable in a practical way, we need to be able to look at information without sideboards that restrict our ability to figure out through Vermont conservation design, where are those most important areas for permanent investments in land conservation. I think one of the reasons that Secretary Moore has come back to the need to think as we develop this plan broadly about the big C of conservation. That is both permanent conservation and all the other forms of conservation that we work with, that we can't make those decisions about where to advance and accelerate permanent land conservation independent of thinking about all the other areas that we're going to be able to conserve through other means. Because in order to identify those areas that are best suited for permanent conservation, we have to be able to have some confidence that the other important areas that might be conserved through other means are also considered. So I think it's just being able to, when the bill finally materializes and we have the responsibility to create the plan, we just need the flexibility to consider all of these pieces of information and existing programs in a way that enables us to come back to you with recommendations for how to achieve some ambitious goals that we know are well-founded in science, know are mindful of all of the suite of conservation programs that are available, because that will help prioritize where we make investments in permanent land conservation. If it would be helpful, I would be happy to encourage some suggested language adjustments for your consideration.
Sure.
Fundamentally, we want to achieve the goals that you want to achieve.
That'd be great.
Yeah, and I'm wondering what we lose in 2802. Serious question. Don't know the answer. If we were to just get rid of the last sentence. So I don't know what the last sentence adds into our goals. It's kind of
Yeah. Further questions? Representative Von
Just a comment. I think that this is an interesting discussion. I think what I'm hearing is that we are actually very much on the same page. And when we talk about the permanent conservation guided by the Vermont conservation design, the question is, within the entirety of lands affected by the Vermont conservation design, which are the highest priorities? And that's what we're trying to get to here. That's what I think we would both agree is what we're trying to, what we want. And so I think number one, here language might be helpful. But I think as I'm sitting here listening to this discussion, it's out of all of it, which are the highest priorities. And they're likely to be those at the highest number one, for instance, and number two, because they're the highest priorities. It's not that we don't want the others, but so I guess maybe trying to figure out how to come up with language. I do feel like we're almost saying the same thing. It's just a matter of how we get very close. Yeah.
The other thing that's really seems important to me when we're talking about using this as a guide, we touched on it probably on Tuesday, which is the geographical distribution. I mean, one of the things that is so powerful to me about Vermont conservation design is the inclusion of the biophysical regions and how our conservation and in that, protecting the 80% of species in the state. So for me, a big part of this plan is helping us say, like, is there a big gap? Is there a place we really need to pay more attention to before it's too late? And so targets can mean different things. We spend a lot of time in this discussion thinking of the numbers of targets, but it's also the areas and the distribution and the use of our conservation dollars wisely today so that we don't blow it and look back in 20 years and say, well, we knew we should have been doing that, but we didn't make a plan to do it. And so it's an inventory of the existing conserved lands and saying, how are those already helping us meet targets, which is, you know, in some ways, the numbers are a proxy for the function. And to the extent that what you're saying here is, you know, kind of informed by that idea, I mean, that's one piece of it. But what really matters is that we actually are doing our work in each of the biophysical regions.
I think that's a really great point. I think that's where we spend our time thinking the most is where are those key areas where you want to have no regrets from a conservation system. And it's got to be guided by an assessment of conservation information. First and foremost, beyond conservation design is the current extent of the conserved landscape and how well that fits with what Vermont conservation design lacks.
And the foundation of this plan is that inventory. It's that's the beginning of it. And so I don't want to lose that. That's a really important piece of this is how much land is conserved in these categories and where, so that we can then begin the conversation of where our priorities need to be.
I mean, I'll be honest with you, as I've thought a lot about your interests in this bill, which I appreciate your interests in conservation. To me, that's the goal. If 50 years from now, the next generation of legislators and conservation practitioners could be having the same conversation about, okay, here's what we got. How are we going to hang on to it for another 50 years? Then we've done our job well. It's less, for me, it's less setting a goal like 30 by 30 or 50 by 50 and more directing the agency to come up with a plan to ensure that we maintain the integrity of that. Tell us how you're going to do it.
Yeah, that's awesome. I support that for sure. And unfortunately, we do know we're not maintaining it right now. And so there is an urgency that a goal helps achieve.
So I look at this and go, this is urgent.
Yeah.
Because there's one little thread pulling it together. And that little thread must be conserved permanently, or it will be gone, or it'll be no action. So that's also what we're trying to get at. Yeah.
Representative Stemmons.
Thanks, Madam Chair. The other piece for me is even if we put this in goal, we had a climate counselor here this morning reminding us of our mandatory requirements, which there are parts of that lead to resilience and adaptation and like making sure, you know, farms and forests are maintained to, you know, sequester carbon, et cetera. So I guess knowing that we have a history of setting forth goals and then not reaching them, not only would I want to see goals, but I no offense to your work, but humans have a history of, you know, if we don't say we really want to lose 30 pounds and then like have a heart attack to remind us that we have to, we often don't. So that's another piece for me. That if we don't make it a very clear intention, then we often let things slide.
Right. Thank you so much for coming in and for the presentation. It's really obvious how much you know and care about this topic, and we really appreciate it.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks for the opportunity.
Yeah.
Thank you.
All right, members, we are on the floor at 3, and then we're back in committee tomorrow at 1:15. With that, we'll adjourn.